Homeless and barely scraping by, a young woman stumbled upon documents that could change her life forever. What she asked for in return, however, left the millionaire utterly stunned. "You must be joking." "That's impossible," he said, barely concealing his shock. Emma walked along the bustling streets of New York, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin and clutching a worn envelope tightly to her chest. Only 18, she had already faced the harsh realities of life on the streets, battling daily just to survive. But today felt different. She had found something that might finally turn her life around. Standing before the gates of an imposing brownstone mansion, her heart raced. Summoning her courage, she pressed the doorbell. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, stern woman, who looked down at Emma with thinly veiled disdain. "What do you want?" the housekeeper asked curtly, her voice sharp and unwelcoming. Emma straightened her back, her voice steady. "I need to speak with Mr. Grant. I have some important documents for him." The housekeeper let out a dry, sarcastic laugh, shaking her head. "Mr. Grant doesn't waste his time on vagrants. If you're looking for handouts, try the shelter," she said, already beginning to close the door. Before the door could shut, Emma wedged her foot in. "I'm not leaving until I give him these papers. I think they're very important," she insisted, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, darting toward the envelope in Emma's hands. "What papers?" she asked skeptically. Emma held up the envelope, pointing to the address neatly written across it. "See? It's addressed to Mr. Grant. I found them and knew I had to bring them here," she explained, keeping her tone calm but resolute. For a moment, the housekeeper seemed unsure, her gaze flickering between the envelope and Emma's determined face. Then, with an irritated huff, she muttered, "Wait here," leaving the door slightly ajar as she disappeared into the house. Emma stood on the doorstep, her heart pounding as she fought to steady her nerves. Minutes later, a tall, impeccably dressed man emerged. His sharp features were etched with annoyance, clearly unhappy about being interrupted. "What is this about?" he snapped, his eyes scanning Emma with suspicion. "I found your documents," Emma said, extending the envelope toward him. Grant took the envelope hesitantly, his skeptical gaze lingering on her as he opened it. He opened it and quickly scanned the contents. His eyes widened as he recognized the documents. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, suspicion lacing his voice. "That's not important right now. What matters is that I've brought them back to you," Emma replied, her voice calm despite his intimidating gaze. Richard squinted, his expression filled with distrust as he studied her. "My documents couldn't have just ended up with you. Where did you get them?" he asked again, his tone sharp and probing. "It doesn't matter," she repeated firmly. "The point is, I knew they were important and made sure you got them." She held the envelope tightly, her knuckles white, as she extended it toward him. Richard glanced at her hands, noticing her firm grip, his curiosity growing but his skepticism remaining intact. "Why should I trust you?" he pressed. "If you found them, why didn't you just leave them or hand them to someone else?" "I couldn't just abandon them or give them to a stranger," Emma replied, unwavering. "Your address was on them. It seemed clear you needed to have them back." Her voice carried a quiet resolve as she met his eyes without flinching. Richard paused, weighing her words, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read between the lines. Slowly, he extended his hand toward the folder. "Show me," he said, his voice guarded but tinged with intrigue. Emma opened the folder and pulled out a few of the documents. Richard scanned them quickly, and his expression shifted. "These are definitely mine," he murmured, his voice dropping slightly. Looking up at her, he still carried a shadow of doubt. "But I don't understand why they ended up with you. Where did you find them?" "I found them near a dumpster," she admitted honestly. "I figured they must be important, so I wanted to return them." Richard studied her intently, digesting her response. Finally, he sighed and stepped away from the door. "Fine. Come in," he said, opening the door wider. Relieved, Emma entered, her steps hesitant but steady. Richard led her to a well-furnished living room and gestured toward the sofa. "Sit down," he said tersely. "Explain exactly how you came across these documents and why you brought them here." Taking the folder, he carefully examined its contents, his face shifting between relief and astonishment. These papers clearly held significant value, and he knew how crucial their return was. After several moments of silence, he looked up at Emma, who sat patiently, her gaze steady and watchful. "These documents are indeed mine," he said, his tone softening slightly. "You did the right thing by bringing them to me. I assumed they were important to you," she responded, a flicker of tension still visible in her eyes. Richard set the papers aside, stood up, and walked over to a nearby desk. Picking up a pen, he began writing on a check. "How much do you want for this?" "Name your price," he said, not looking up as he continued writing. Emma took a deep breath, knowing her request would be unconventional, maybe even risky. "I don't want money," she said firmly, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I want you to treat me like your daughter. Just for a week." Richard froze, her words echoing in the room like a challenge he hadn't anticipated. Slowly, he put the pen down and turned to face her fully, his eyes wide with surprise. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and incredulous. "I've never had a real family," she said, her tone earnest and edged with quiet desperation. "I want to know what it feels like to have a father, even if it's just for a week." Richard exhaled deeply, trying to make sense of her unexpected plea. He had assumed she would ask for money or some material reward, but this was something entirely different. Something in her vulnerability struck a chord deep within him, a part of himself he thought had long been buried. He had lost his own father as a child and knew the ache of that absence all too well. "You want me to treat you like my daughter for a week?" Richard repeated, still trying to process what he had just heard. "Yes, that's all I ask," Emma replied firmly. "I don't want money or anything material. I just want to experience what it feels like to be part of a family, even if only for a short time." Richard stared at her, utterly baffled. The idea seemed completely absurd to him. Letting a homeless young woman stay in his house, even for a week, went against all his instincts and usual way of thinking. He had neither the time nor the desire to entertain such a request, and frankly, he wasn't even sure if her story was true. Do you realize how ridiculous this sounds?" he finally said, eyeing her with suspicion. "Why should I waste my time on someone I don't even know?" Emma didn't back down. Her gaze was steady, unwavering despite Richard's cold tone. "Because I'm not asking for anything material. I don't need your money or your help in the usual sense. I just want to understand what it feels like to belong to a family, even briefly," she said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with sincerity. Richard studied her face intently. He saw vulnerability there, but also an undeniable strength. Something in her expression made him pause. Maybe it was her determination, or perhaps her words touched a part of him he had long buried. "Why me? Why should I be the one?" he finally asked. "Because you have what I've always dreamed of. A home, a family, the chance to feel part of something bigger," Emma said softly. "I know it sounds strange, but I found your documents and decided to do what felt right. Now, I'm just asking for a chance to experience what family life is like, even if it's just for a week." Her voice softened, but her words hit Richard harder than he expected. He fell silent, turning her request over in his mind. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea, one that could only lead to trouble. Yet, there was something in her resolve, in the hope shining through her eyes, that he couldn't ignore. "Fine," he said at last, letting out a heavy sigh. "You can stay here for a week, but that doesn't mean I trust you." Emma nodded, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, Richard. This means more to me than you could ever imagine," she said quietly. "Just Richard," he corrected her with a faint smile. "All right, we'll start tomorrow. You can stay here in the mansion for the week. I'll have a room prepared for you." "Thank you, Richard," she said, smiling for the first time since their conversation began. Richard stood up and rang the bell. The housekeeper appeared, her stern expression unchanged but tinged with curiosity. "Prepare a room for Emma," Richard instructed. "She'll be staying with us for a week." The housekeeper raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Emma followed her down the long hallway, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension about what lay ahead. Richard watched them disappear into the corridor, still mulling over her unusual request. As Emma walked behind the housekeeper, she couldn't shake the conflicting emotions swirling inside her, a sense of gratitude, hope, and a nervous anticipation of what the next week would bring. On one hand, she felt relieved that Richard had agreed to her unusual request, but on the other, she was nervous about what the coming days might bring. The housekeeper led her to a small yet cozy room, furnished with a soft bed, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the garden. "Here's your room," the housekeeper said with a slight pause. "If you need anything, knock on the kitchen door." "Thank you," Emma replied softly, trying to mask her unease. The housekeeper was about to leave but stopped at the doorway. "And remember, you're only here for a week, don't get too comfortable," she added before stepping out, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. Emma looked around. Compared to where she had stayed before, this place felt almost magical. She sat cautiously on the bed, as though afraid she might damage something. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Later that evening, Richard sat in the living room, still contemplating Emma's peculiar request. The door soon opened, and his wife, Elizabeth, entered carrying several bags from upscale stores, clearly pleased with her shopping haul. Elizabeth, a woman accustomed to luxury and comfort, saw shopping as a routine indulgence. "Dima, what's wrong?" she asked, noticing his serious expression. She set her bags down and moved closer. Richard glanced up, took a deep breath, and motioned for her to sit beside him. "We need to talk about something unexpected," he began. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine but took a seat, watching him closely. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "A young woman named Emma came to see me today. She found the important documents I lost a few days ago." "You remember I mentioned them," Richard started, gauging her reaction. But instead of asking for money, she made a rather unusual request. "What kind of request?" Elizabeth frowned, her tone shifting to suspicion. "She asked me to treat her as if she were my daughter. For 1 week," Richard explained, bracing for her response. Elizabeth's eyes widened in disbelief. She was at a loss for words. "And you agreed?" she finally exclaimed, her voice filled with shock. "Yes, I did," Richard said, trying to keep his wife calm. "What? You agreed?" she repeated, her voice shaking with outrage. "You're a grown man, and you let some random girl into our home?" Richard sighed, striving to stay composed. "I know it sounds strange, but there was sincerity in her words. She's been through a lot, and I thought we could do this for her," he explained. "A tough story?" Elizabeth's voice grew louder, her anger evident. "Richard, are you serious? Have you even considered the possibility that she's manipulating you? That this could be some sort of scam?" Her face reddened as her tone sharpened. "How old is she?" Elizabeth demanded. 20, Richard answered calmly. Elizabeth gasped, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. 20? You let a 20-year-old homeless girl stay in our house? She's young, she's beautiful, and you think this is a good idea? Richard, are you out of your mind? She clutched her head, her frustration mounting. Do you even realize how this looks? How could you possibly think this is okay? Elizabeth, I've thought it through, Richard replied firmly. It's just for a week. All she wants is to experience what it feels like to be part of a family, Richard said, his gaze steady as he spoke. To feel like part of a family? Elizabeth scoffed, her smile sharp with sarcasm. Richard, do you even hear yourself? This is a scam, plain and simple. She saw your wealth and decided to take advantage of your kindness, and you, like some naive boy, fell for it immediately. Richard's voice remained calm, but his tone was firm. Elizabeth, I get it. This is hard for you to accept. But you haven't even spoken to her yet. She didn't ask for money or help. Her request is simple, and it's genuine. I trust my instincts. Your instincts? Elizabeth snapped. Richard, you don't understand how people like her operate. First, they earn your trust. Then, they start exploiting you. She was clearly upset, her frustration evident. Richard exhaled slowly and gently held her hand. Elizabeth, please, just take a breath. I've got everything under control. She's only staying for a week. If something feels off, we'll talk about it then. But I can't turn away someone who came here with good intentions. Especially after she returned something I thought I'd lost forever. Elizabeth pulled her hand back but seemed calmer. She let out a heavy sigh and shook her head. Fine, she said reluctantly. But let me be clear. I don't like this one bit. I'll be watching her. And the second something seems suspicious, you'll be the first to hear about it. That's fair, Richard agreed, offering her a soft smile. Just give her a chance. Elizabeth shrugged and headed toward the door, throwing a parting comment over her shoulder. Let's see how you feel about this in a week. Richard sighed, knowing it wouldn't be easy to convince her, but he felt secure in his choice. Later, at dinner, Emma descended the stairs carefully, clearly trying to avoid drawing too much attention. Richard and Elizabeth were already seated at the table. Elizabeth's gaze swept over Emma, scrutinizing her from head to toe with an expression that was both assessing and wary. Emma, this is my wife, Elizabeth, Richard said, his tone light but purposeful. It's very nice to meet you, Emma said, her voice steady despite a hint of nervousness. Elizabeth's smile was icy, her eyes still guarded. Nice to meet you too, Emma, she replied, her words laced with sarcasm. Richard told me about your request. I hope you understand this is highly unusual for us. Her voice was detached and cool. Emma, sensing the hostility, lowered her gaze. Yes, I understand, Mrs. Elizabeth. I'm incredibly grateful you've allowed me to stay, she said quietly. Elizabeth's brow furrowed, her tone growing sharper. You know, requests like this are rarely without strings. People don't just show up at someone's doorstep without a reason. Are you sure you've told Richard everything? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Richard noticed Emma's pale face and intervened. Elizabeth, that's enough. Emma is here because I invited her, and I trust her sincerity, he said, his voice carrying a hint of sternness. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. Richard, you're too trusting. You've let a 20-year-old girl with no family or home into our house. Do you even realize how often these kinds of stories end badly? She turned her gaze back to Emma. And why us? What do you want from all this? Emma lifted her eyes, trying to maintain composure despite the tremor in her voice. I don't want anything except to feel what it's like to be part of a family. I promise I won't be any trouble. Aunt's response was measured, almost cold. She allowed a faint smile. Family, such a touching concept. But in our household, we don't usually extend our hospitality to strangers. Aren't you worried about how this might be misinterpreted? She said with biting sarcasm. That's enough, Aunt, Richard interjected, a tinge of reprimand in his tone as he glanced at his wife. Give her a chance. Aunt fell silent, her expression a mix of irritation and suspicion. With a final sharp look at Emma, she gave a dismissive snort and returned to her meal. Emma lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. Richard, on the other hand, tried to lighten the mood, steering the conversation toward casual topics in an effort to ease the tension at the table. Eventually, Aunt decided to rejoin the discussion. All right, she said, her voice softer but still tinged with caution. Let's say I believe you. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? How did you end up in this situation? Taking a deep breath, Emma began to speak. I grew up on the streets. I have no family. I lost my mother when I was very young, and I never knew my father. Ever since then, I've been surviving on my own, doing whatever it took just to make it through each day, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Aunt's eyes studied her closely, as if searching for any hidden motives. Richard, on the other hand, felt his sympathy for Emma grow with every word she spoke. That must have been incredibly difficult for you, he said gently. Yes, Richard, but I've learned to be strong. Every day was a battle. When I found your documents, I realized how important they were and wanted to do the right thing, Emma explained, her sincerity shining through. And what exactly do you hope to gain from all this? Aunt asked, still trying to gauge the young woman's intentions. I just want to know what it's like to have a family, even if only for a short while. I've never had that, but it's always been my dream, Emma confessed, her voice filled with pain and vulnerability. Despite her initial skepticism, Aunt's demeanor began to shift. Her expression softened slightly, though she still seemed unsure about the challenges this might bring. Fine, Emma. This week will be a test for all of us. Let's see if we can learn something from it, Aunt said, making an effort to show some understanding. Thank you, Aunt Sergeyevna. I promise I won't disappoint you, Emma replied, her gratitude accompanied by a faint, genuine smile. The rest of the dinner carried on with lighter conversations, but Emma's presence introduced a new dynamic to the table. The week began with unease but gradually started to take on a different tone. The next morning brought a sense of apprehension for Emma. Why, she wasn't sure what to expect and worried that her presence would stir up more resentment from Aunt. Richard, however, seemed determined to make her feel welcome. Emma, have you decided what you'd like to do today? Richard asked over breakfast, trying to ease the tension. I'd really like to learn more about your daily life, Richard, I'm curious about how you spend your day, Emma said, nervously fidgeting with the edge of her napkin, though her tone reflected genuine interest. Of course, Richard replied warmly, smiling. I have a few meetings at the office today. You're welcome to join me and see what my day looks like firsthand. Elizabeth, seated nearby, crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. Her displeasure was obvious, but she chose to remain silent, continuing her breakfast as Richard and Emma carried on their conversation. After they finished eating, Richard led Emma to his home office, a place he spent much of his time handling business matters. This is my workspace, he explained, gesturing around the room. I manage my companies here and hold important meetings. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thank you, Richard, I've never seen anything like this before. It's amazing, Emma replied, her awe evident as she took in the office's grandeur. Throughout the day, Richard involved Emma in some of his tasks. She observed him in action, listened to his conversations with partners, and even helped organize some documents. Her genuine curiosity and eagerness to learn didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, Richard decided to take Emma to a nearby park. They strolled through the fresh air, and Richard grew curious about her past. "Emma, tell me, how did you survive on the streets for so many years?" he asked, his voice filled with sincere concern. "It was incredibly hard, Richard. Every day felt like a fight. I scavenged for food wherever I could and took on any work I could find. But the loneliness, that was the hardest part. I always wished for someone I could trust," Emma admitted, her voice trembling as she recalled her struggles. Richard felt a wave of compassion for her. Having experienced life without a supportive family himself, her story deeply moved him. They continued talking, sharing moments of their lives, and even laughed together at lighter memories. However, not everyone in the household welcomed Emma's presence. Elizabeth remained a source of tension, scrutinizing her every move with judgmental eyes. This was especially evident during a family dinner when Richard's relatives came to visit. "So, how do you know Dima?" one of Elizabeth's aunts asked, her tone laced with thinly veiled condescension. "She's been staying with us for a week, helping with some personal matters," Richard quickly replied, attempting to shift the focus. "Interesting. And where are you from, dear?" the aunt pressed, her smile polite but her voice edged with suspicion. "I grew up on the streets without a family," Emma said calmly. "Richard and Elizabeth have given me a chance to feel what it's like to have a home, even if it's only temporary." The room fell silent, though the subtle glances and murmured conversations carried on beneath the surface. Emma stood her ground, realizing that this opportunity was rare and she couldn't let others' opinions ruin her experience. Richard, noticing her discomfort, made it his mission to help her feel more at ease. The next morning, he suggested they spend time together in the kitchen, preparing something simple to create a sense of family routine. "Emma, do you enjoy cooking?" Richard asked as he sliced vegetables. "I've never really had the chance to try, but I've always been curious," Emma admitted with a smile. "Well then, let's make something easy but tasty. It's not just about cooking, it's a way to feel what it's like to be part of a family," Richard said encouragingly. As days passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Richard began to see more than a vulnerable young woman in Emma. He saw someone with immense potential and a drive to thrive. Emma, in turn, started to feel a warmth and care she had never experienced before. Her time at the estate gradually became more comfortable, even as Richard's strained relationship with Elizabeth cast a shadow over the household. One morning, Emma decided to pitch in by making breakfast. Rising early, she set out to prepare a meal, only to be met with Elizabeth's cold disapproval. "What are you doing in here?" Elizabeth demanded as she saw Emma at the stove, making an omelet. "I just wanted to help." "Richard said I should try making breakfast," Emma replied, keeping her composure. "Of course, he did," Elizabeth sneered. "Do you think acting sweet will make everyone here adore you?" Shaken by the accusation, Emma tried to explain. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Elizabeth. I just wanted to understand what it feels like to be part of a family, even if it's only temporary," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Elizabeth crossed her arms and glared. "A family? Do you think you can just waltz into our lives and belong here?" "Don't be naive," she retorted, her tone dripping with disdain. Emma fought back tears. "I know it's hard to accept, but I'm not here to deceive or manipulate anyone. All I wanted was to experience this, just for a little while," she whispered, lowering her gaze. Elizabeth scoffed. "I see right through you. You're using your sob story to tug at Richard's heartstrings. And it seems he's fallen for it," she accused. "That's not true," Emma said, her voice rising for the first time as anger bubbled inside her. "All I've ever asked for was to feel what it's like to be part of a family, even briefly. Nothing more." Tension hung thick in the air as Elizabeth stepped closer, her face inches from Emma's. "I don't believe you," she hissed. "And I'll make sure Richard sees you for who you really are." With that, Elizabeth stormed out, leaving Emma stunned and shaken. Standing frozen, Emma tried to collect herself, her hands trembling. But she knew she couldn't give up. Richard's promise to treat her like a daughter, even for just a week, was her only chance to feel a glimpse of familial warmth. Later that day, Richard noticed Emma looking distraught. He found her sitting in the garden, gazing into the distance with a sorrowful expression. "Emma, is everything okay?" he asked gently, sitting beside her. No, Richard, she replied quietly, her eyes welling with tears. Your wife thinks I'm here to manipulate you. She doesn't trust me. Richard let out a deep sigh, running his hand through his hair. I knew this would be difficult for her, but I never imagined it would go this far. I'll talk to Elizabeth. This can't go on, he said firmly, his voice steady. Thank you, Richard, but I don't want to cause trouble for you, Emma replied softly. All I wanted was a little peace and the warmth of a family, she added, sadness evident in her tone. Placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, Richard replied, I understand, Emma. And I promise, I'll do everything I can to make you feel like part of this family. We'll get through this together, he said with quiet determination. That evening, tension filled the air during dinner. Elizabeth's disapproving glances at Emma didn't escape Richard's notice. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, he spoke. Elizabeth, we need to talk about this, he said firmly, his voice tense. About what? About how this girl is manipulating you? Elizabeth retorted, crossing her arms. Emma isn't trying to deceive anyone. She just wants to know what it feels like to have a family. Please, try to understand, Richard said, meeting her gaze directly. Understand? You want me to understand that you've brought a stranger into our home and are treating her like she's your daughter? That's absurd. Elizabeth snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. Richard sighed deeply. I know this is hard for you to accept, but Emma isn't to blame. She's never had a family, and I want to give her the chance to experience that. She's done nothing wrong, Elizabeth, he said, trying to calm her. Elizabeth glanced at Emma, who sat silently, clearly uncomfortable. If you want to help her, fine. But don't expect me to be happy about it, Elizabeth replied coldly before leaving the table abruptly. Emma stared at the floor, trying to hold back tears. Richard's sympathetic look met hers. It'll be all right, Emma. I promise, he said, offering her comfort. That night was a tough one for everyone. Elizabeth, fuming, locked herself in the bedroom, avoiding any interaction with Richard. Emma lay in her room, wondering if she should even stay. She felt out of place, but Richard's promise gave her a sliver of hope. By morning, the tension in the house was almost palpable. Despite his exhaustion, Richard resolved to tackle the situation head-on. He invited Emma to join him for breakfast in the garden, hoping to lift her spirits. Good morning, Emma, he greeted warmly as she hesitantly approached the table. Good morning, Richard, she replied with a small smile, though worry lingered in her eyes. Today, I want to show you around the city. I think it'll do you good to get out for a bit, Richard suggested. Thank you. I think I'd like that, Emma replied, grateful for his kindness. At that moment, Elizabeth stepped into the garden. She clearly wasn't thrilled by what she saw but managed a cold nod in their direction. Elizabeth, would you like to join us? Richard asked, trying to ease the tension. No, I have other things to do, she replied curtly before walking away. Richard sighed but decided not to dwell on her behavior. Instead, he focused on making the day memorable for Emma. Later, they explored the city. Richard showed her places that held special meaning for him. An old library where he had spent hours as a young man, a cozy cafe where he had worked on projects, and a serene park where he often went to reflect. This is beautiful. I've never been to places like these, Emma said in awe, taking in her surroundings. It's not just beautiful. It's meaningful, Richard replied with a smile. These places help me remember who I am, no matter how much wealth or success I achieve, Richard said with a smile. At one point, they stopped by a small cafe for some tea. Richard decided to ask a question that had been on his mind for a while. Emma, have you ever thought about what you want to do in the future? Do you have a dream? He asked, watching her intently. Emma lowered her gaze, thinking deeply. No, honestly, I've never really thought about it. Living on the streets, all my energy went into surviving each day. But if I ever had the chance, I think I'd like to study. Go to college. It always seemed out of reach, but it's something I'd love to try, she admitted softly. Richard's smile grew warmer as he listened. Then let's make that possible. I'll help you get there. You have potential, and I won't let it go to waste, he said firmly. Emma looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears of gratitude. Thank you, Richard. That means more to me than I can express, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. When they returned home, Emma seemed happier, and Richard felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. But Elizabeth, seeing them together, couldn't hide her irritation. Looks like you two had a lovely time, she said sarcastically, glaring at Emma. It was important for her, Richard replied calmly, trying to avoid conflict. Important. What's next on your list of good deeds for this girl? Elizabeth shot back, her anger bubbling over. I'll do whatever I believe is right. Emma deserves a chance, Richard said firmly, meeting her glare head-on. Elizabeth scoffed and walked away, leaving them alone. Emma felt a pang of guilt. Richard, maybe I should leave? I don't want to cause trouble in your family, she said quietly. Richard looked at her seriously. No, Emma. You're not causing trouble. You're reminding me of what really matters in life. I want you to stay, he said confidently. Emma nodded, but her heart still felt uneasy. That night, Richard lay awake for hours, his mind racing. Elizabeth's growing hostility and Emma's feelings of being unwelcome weighed heavily on him. He knew his decision to take Emma in had given her hope but had also disrupted the delicate balance within his family. The next morning, Richard made a final decision. After breakfast, he took Elizabeth aside to his office for a serious conversation. Elizabeth, I can't keep doing this. You need to understand that Emma isn't here to harm us. But if you can't accept her, even for a few days, then we need to figure out what's truly tearing our marriage apart, he said, his voice resolute. Elizabeth stayed silent, her face cold, though her emotions churned inside. Are you seriously choosing this girl over your own wife? She finally asked. I'm not choosing her over you. I'm trying to do what's right. But maybe you're right, our problems started long before this, Richard replied. Elizabeth said nothing and walked out, leaving him alone in the office. Later that day, Richard left for a meeting. He came home late, exhausted. The house was quiet except for the light in the living room, where Elizabeth sat reading a magazine. She barely glanced at him before returning to her reading. Richard, masking his fatigue, went upstairs to his office to sort through his things. As he opened the door, he immediately noticed the small jewelry box on his desk was open. Inside, the gold ring he always kept there was missing. Frowning, Richard rarely worried about such things, trusting everyone in the house. But he went downstairs and found Elizabeth in the living room. Elizabeth, did you take the ring from my office? He asked, keeping his tone even. Elizabeth looked up, her expression suddenly serious. Number? Why do you ask? Are your things missing too? I thought I just misplaced my necklace, she said, sounding worried. What do you mean, too? This can't be a coincidence. I always keep the ring in the box, Richard said firmly. Oh, I see what's happening, Elizabeth snapped. It's your precious Emma. Richard stepped back, a mix of shock and disbelief crossing his face. Ma, do you think it was her? He asked, though his voice carried a trace of doubt. Who else could it be? No one else has been in the house, and the things disappeared while she was here. I told you letting her in was a bad idea, but you wouldn't listen, Elizabeth snapped, her voice trembling with anger. Dmitri ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to believe Emma could do such a thing, but all signs pointed to her. Determined to uncover the truth, he hurried to her room. He knocked, but there was no response. Emma, are you in there? He called out, his voice shaky. When no answer came, he opened the door to find the room empty. The bed was untouched, her belongings were gone. Dmitri froze, a storm of conflicting emotions washing over him. He searched the room desperately, hoping for some clue to prove her innocence, but nothing. She had vanished. How could I have been so naive, he muttered to himself. Returning to Elizabeth, he sank into a chair, his face etched with despair. You were right, he admitted quietly. I was wrong. She fooled us? Of course, I was right, Elizabeth retorted sharply, her eyes blazing with anger. You always think you can fix people, but this time your kindness backfired. Maybe now you'll understand you can't trust everyone. Even as he acknowledged his mistake, doubt gnawed at Dmitri. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emma wasn't capable of such betrayal. Her sincerity, the way she spoke about family, it all lingered in his mind. He had to know the truth. At dawn, Dmitri set out to find her. He drove around the city, asking strangers, stopping by shelters, but for hours he found no trace of her. Finally, as he was about to give up, he spotted her near the park. She sat on a bench clutching an old backpack, her shoulders hunched. Dmitri approached her, his face a mix of anger and disappointment. How could you? He demanded, his voice drawing her attention. I opened my home to you, gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? You stole from us and ran away. Emma jumped to her feet, her wide eyes filled with shock. What? What are you talking about? She stammered, staring at him. Don't play innocent. My ring and Elizabeth's jewelry are missing, and so are you, Dmitri accused, his tone sharp. Emma shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. That's not true, I didn't take anything, she said firmly, though her voice quivered. Elizabeth told me to leave. She said I didn't belong there and had to go immediately. I don't know what happened to your things. Dmitri froze, her words hitting him hard. Elizabeth told you to leave? He repeated, his voice now quieter. Yes, she told me to leave while you were away. I didn't even get the chance to explain what happened, Emma said, her face heavy with despair. Richard felt a surge of anger well up inside him. It was becoming clear that Elizabeth might have taken advantage of the situation to push Emma out, using the missing items as a convenient excuse. I'm sorry, Emma, Richard muttered softly. It seems I've made a terrible mistake. When Richard and Emma arrived home, Elizabeth was waiting in the foyer. The moment her eyes landed on Emma, she froze. Her face went pale, and her wide eyes betrayed shock and fear. She knew she would have to explain herself now. Elizabeth, we need to talk, Richard said coldly as he entered the house, gesturing for Emma to follow him. Richard, I can explain everything, Elizabeth began, her voice shaking. But Richard raised a hand to stop her. Explain? He said, his voice restrained but simmering with anger. You sent Emma away while I was gone and accused her of stealing from us. Do you even realize how despicable that is? Elizabeth tried to defend herself. But she could have taken something. You saw the things were missing. I was just protecting our home, she said, her voice growing louder in a desperate attempt to justify her actions. Richard stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fury. Protecting? He repeated, his voice rising. You lied to me. You deliberately threw her out and fabricated this story about theft. How could you, Elizabeth? You preyed on my fears to get rid of her. She's a stranger, Richard. We don't even know her. I just didn't want someone like her living here with us, Elizabeth shouted, but her voice now wavered with uncertainty. Emma has done nothing wrong, Richard replied, his voice icy. She's an honest person who deserves kindness, not betrayal. But you've destroyed my trust, Elizabeth. That's something I can't forgive. Elizabeth stared at him in shock. Are you really going to throw me out because of her? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Richard said firmly, looking away. You've shown me who you truly are. Pack your things and leave. For a few seconds, Elizabeth stood motionless before spinning around and heading upstairs to gather her belongings. Her face was a mixture of anger and humiliation. Emma, standing nearby, was stunned by what she had just witnessed. Richard, I don't want to cause you any trouble. Maybe I should just go, she said quietly. Richard turned to her, his expression softening. No, Emma. You've done nothing wrong. I made you a promise, and I intend to keep it. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. This house is your home now, he said with a warm smile. Soon after, Elizabeth left the house. Richard felt a sense of relief, though a hint of sadness lingered over the end of his marriage. Still, he knew he had made the right decision. Determined to help Emma build a better future, Richard offered her work around the house so she could feel independent. You can work here and study at the same time. I'll help you with school, he told her over dinner. Do you really mean it? You'd pay for my education? Emma asked, surprised. Yes, Richard replied confidently. You have so much potential, and I want to see you succeed. You deserve this. Emma was deeply moved. Thank you, Richard. I never imagined anyone would believe in me like this, she said, tears filling her eyes. You deserve it, Richard said with a kind smile. And please, just call me Richard. Months passed. Emma threw herself into her studies, quickly catching up on everything she had missed. Richard took great pride in her accomplishments. The bond between them grew, feeling almost like family. Richard began to see Emma as the daughter he never had, while Emma found in him the supportive and caring figure she had always longed for. One evening, while sitting in the garden, Richard looked at Emma and smiled. You know, Emma, you've changed my life. After everything, I thought I'd lost my sense of purpose, but you brought hope back to me, he said. Emma smiled warmly. And you've given me the home and family I've always dreamed of. Thank you for everything, Richard, she replied. In that moment, both of them realized their lives had been forever transformed. Richard not only found a friend in Emma but also discovered a daughter he never expected, while Emma finally gained the family she had always longed for. Thank you for listening to this story all the way through. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinion in the comments. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this story, and send it to your friends and loved ones. Your support inspires us to keep creating meaningful stories every day. Don't miss the next incredible story coming to your screen soon. We truly appreciate having you with us. Check out the description below for a complete catalog of our stories. See you next time.